Hi, good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, hi. I'm Marcello Palazzi. I'm going to moderate this session with Rick Alexander, who is going to share with us his knowledge and his experience of the Benefit Corporation. So I'm just going to kick it off for a few minutes, give a little introduction. So basically, B Corps are a movement to, as we say in the program here, the responsible revolution. It's a movement of companies that measure their success by impact. There are 2,302, I think, B Corps in the world. See if I can show here some of the logos of some well-known companies, some of the subsidiaries of Danone, Ben & Jerry, Patagonia, and a lot of young companies, new companies. The average age of B Corps is quite young, 5, 6, 10 years old, in more than 50 countries. And it's a certification system plus, so companies have to go through an impact assessment to basically monitor over 200 indicators, so it's quite a challenging process. And it started 10 years ago from the United States, but with the European heritage, i.e. the US at the time was looking at Global Reporting Initiative and other reporting standards that would allow us to shift away from the shareholders' primacy, the paradigm of profit above everything, towards a more stakeholder primacy, which was something that I think we knew in Europe already, 20, 30 years ago. So some faces, it's all about people at the end. Companies don't decide, people decide. So here you have some from Yvonne Chouinard of Patagonia, Emmanuel Faber of Danone, Elizabeth Laville, Utopie, Al Gore, Generation Investment Management. These are all people who run B Corps, to show you there is a wide acceptance all around the world. Some of the stories, I'm not going to go into details, but it's interesting to see a lot of young companies like Fairphone, which is fair-traded mobile phones, slave-free chocolate, Tony Chocolonely, Solaris, it's a magnifying solar panel company. Roshan, which is probably the second largest company in Afghanistan, the B Corp for now 3 or 4 years. Puka Herbs, bought by Unilever. So this is just a mix of, to show you the different sectors, different industries where companies are. This is, for me, the kind of the essential slide, and I'm going to just show you this for a moment. Basically, what we are saying is that impact is a new measure of success. And like investors now usually talk about risk and return, and now they're adding impact. So the impact investors are adding impact to the risk and return measurement. And what we say is that just these 3 Bs, business, brand, and book value, is basically if you really go through the impact assessment and you look at your company as a vehicle, a tool for positive change, you actually receive business benefits and brand benefits and book benefits. The value of your company can grow. Even look at questions of risk and reputation. Many investors now know that minimizing risk is a way to increase your future performance. And so basically when you go through the discipline of becoming a B Corp, you have to go through this process of good governance, ethics, risk minimization, et cetera, which adds actually value to your company. So this is really business logic behind becoming a B Corp. We had sessions yesterday about B Corps. There'll be more conversation going on in the next few days. What happened about 5 years into this process is that some lawyers got interested in, can we actually embed all these principles into a legislation? So in the United States, I think about 5 or 6 years ago, the first lawyers created a benefit corporation by law, which is now being accepted in 33 states. And last year also was passed in Italy. And there are 5 or 6 countries, Australia, Argentina, Taiwan, Colombia, Peru, that are actually in discussion in their parliaments at various stages about benefit corporation being passed in those countries. So we see we have a 2-track. One track is you certify as a B Corp, and the second track is you become by law a benefit corporation. And so there's a lot of momentum, because this is basically the heart of the capitalist system, is creating a legal, or more than one legal form, that actually allows us to pursue multiple objectives. So not only profit, but social impact and environmental progress, as well as all kinds of cultural things like diversity and women empowerment, etc. So it's how do we do that in a way that is more embedded in the legislation. So this is where I leave it to Rick. Rick is going to make a presentation and show you what he has learned over the years. And then after Rick's presentation, we open up and we have a dialogue with all of you. So thank you. Rick, for you.
Thanks, Marcello. Let's see if I can get my slides up here. Okay, success. Well, thanks, Marcello, for that introduction. I think that really helped to sort of set a little bit of context. I also wanted to give a little bit of context about this talk versus sort of what we heard yesterday. And I don't know how many of you sat in for a lot of the sessions yesterday, but I found them to be very inspiring. I heard a lot of stories about a lot of people starting businesses that are going to help a lot of people around the world, whether it's bringing clean water or light or making products in a responsible way. It's exactly what we have to see in the world in order to get where we want to get. And so that sort of building from the ground up, I think, is the only way we're going to get there. That said, what I'm going to talk about today is much more top-down and maybe less inspiring and more like a university lecture. So I apologize in advance, and I'm going to just ask you to indulge me and try to hang on through this, because I will try at the end to sort of explain why I think it's so important that while we as a movement are building from the bottom up to have a better society, we have to also deal with the headwinds that are sort of fighting what we want to do. And so I want to talk about the capital markets and legal structure and how we need to change that in order to scale all the great things we heard about yesterday. Let me just say a little bit about myself. Rick Alexander. I spent about 25 years practicing law in Delaware, and Delaware is sort of the heart of corporate law in the United States. I'm going to wait for these people to come in because this is great. Go in the middle. No, you don't have to go to the side. Just walk right in. There's lots of seats.
That's a plane, that's not a bus.
I think they sent them all here from the other theater. They all missed your presentation.
That's enough.
Okay, so we just doubled in size. I won't try to summarize anything, and you didn't miss much in my part. You missed Marcello's nice talk, but so I was just starting to say, I'm Rick Alexander. I practiced law for about 25 years as a corporate lawyer in Wilmington, Delaware. And in that career, I was very focused on, I would say, sort of traditional corporate law, helping larger companies raise funds, helping them do mergers and acquisitions transactions, helping them with corporate governance. It's like the clown car. Oh, come on in. But I was very embedded in the system as it is today, with sort of what Marcello referred to as shareholder primacy, sort of the idea that corporations, the main idea of a corporation is to make money, and it's not because I had particularly conservative leanings. I'm probably a traditional, in the U.S. sense, liberal, progressive, want clean environment, want workers to do well, but I always sort of thought of that as something that governments do. That's government's responsibility, and businesses' responsibility is to make money. And sort of the idea of the benefit corporation is to take that on and say, well, no, that's not quite right. The responsibility of businesses to make money as well. But that wasn't really the way we traditionally saw it in corporate law. And what happened was, as Marcello said, B-Lab started trying to sort of change the dynamic and get states to adopt benefit corporation legislation. And at the time, I was the head of the council in Delaware that advised the legislature on making changes to corporate law. And so they came to us with this idea, and we sort of looked at them and said, well, that's the silliest thing we ever heard. Corporations aren't these institutions that are here to do good. They're here to do business. Good is done by governments. Good is done by NGOs. And we sort of sent them on their way, but they came back and they asked us to look harder. And I was tasked with the job of looking harder and making recommendations to the larger group. And I got really interested, and I'm here sort of as a convert. So 6 years ago, I didn't really believe in the benefit corporation idea. Now I'm a strong proponent. In fact, I work for B-Lab. I left my law practice and went to work for B-Lab as head of legal policy. And what I want to share with you today is sort of the thinking that got me there. So I'm not going to talk so much about the specifics of benefit corporation law, because I think you could incorporate these ideas into statutes around the world in different ways. What I really want to talk about is the larger idea and why I think this change is so critical. And so you can see what I call the presentation is the misallocation of capital, because although we're talking about corporate laws, what those laws really do is tell us how we're going to allocate our financial capital across the economy. So first, let me say capitalism. Despite the subject, I want to say I'm a firm capitalist. I believe that capital is the fuel that sort of allows us to make the goods and services that make us all have better lives. So the idea of using private business to allocate capital is not something that I'm attacking in this at all. I also want to say I'm not attacking corporations. Corporations are sort of an amazing technology in that they allow diversified holders across the globe to pool their capital and diversify it and put it into all sorts of different investments, and that allows us to grow the economy. It's actually a terrific idea. And there's a history of the corporation that's kind of interesting. You can think of that history as starting perhaps around the 1600s, when countries started saying to trading companies, well, it's good for our country if we have trade with other countries, so we're going to give these groups monopolies to trade, and we're going to let them pool their capital, and we're going to give them limited liability, all these ideas to sort of spur trading. And then the next idea was, well, now we need to build canals and roads and bridges and railways, and we're going to give people the rights to do the same thing. And then that grew to other types of companies that needed large amounts of capital, sort of manufacturers, textiles, things like that. And eventually what happened was we had the idea of general incorporation, the idea that any business could form a corporation, get limited liability, perpetual life, and all the benefits that a citizen, a person has, even though this is artificial. So remember, the corporation is something completely artificial, created by the government to allow people to pool capital and put a business together. And what happened in that evolution is we went from incorporating businesses that we thought would do a particular good thing for society, trade, manufacture, infrastructure, to the idea that business is good, so anyone should be able to incorporate by taking $100 and filing a piece of paper with the Secretary of State. And that's what we have today. So that's sort of where the corporation came from. Now, what we do with that corporation is we allocate capital, as I said. So where's the capital today? Well, VOE is value of everything. You take all the financial capital and real estate around the world, it's worth about 35 trillion US dollars. 100 of that's debt, but this is what I want to focus on, this 70 and 10. 70 of that is public equity, common stock in public corporations around the globe. Another 10 million is stock in private equity and venture capital around the world. And that equity, the stock, tends to control everything. So this $80 trillion really controls like all our resources. And so you think about, okay, we want to do good in the world. We want to make sure our environment is safe. We want to make sure workers have a livable wage. We want to make sure there's a future for our children and our children's children. That's all about how we allocate our capital and how we produce goods and services. And really this equity, this public equity and private equity, that pretty much controls like how we do that. So who allocates the capital? Now you might say, well, the answer is we need to get government and NGOs on board. But the problem is that it's business and consumers that make most of the spending decisions around the world, roughly 80-20. So most of the decisions are actually made by private business. And so that's all through what I want to call the investment channel. I think you can see that up there. So here's I'm going to fill this in, but the investment channel is sort of, you've got savers at the top and, the actual assets down at the bottom. So the investment's going down, and then the duty, what do I do? What am I supposed to do with those assets is going up. So what do we have at the top? The actual people who have that $80 trillion are not like billionaires and people in pinstripe suits on Wall Street or in the city in London. It's it's savers, it's pensioners, it's people putting money in their defined pension plan, their defined benefit plan, or their defined contribution plan. It's insurance companies that have life insurance policies and casualty policies who are investing that money that you've put into them. It's the beneficiaries of endowments like students or whoever benefits from foundations, citizens. It's the citizens who benefit from sovereign wealth funds. So that's where the money starts. And then it goes down to these funds that I just mentioned. And then those funds give it to asset managers. And then those asset managers give it to public companies and private companies. That's the real economy. So you've got this complicated, and it's really more this is a very simplified chart, but you've got this chart of intermediation with the investment going down and the duty, what do I do with that money? How am I supposed to apply it going up? So what's the purpose of that industry? What should that industry be doing with that $80 trillion in equity? Well, they need to protect and grow our savings, right? Like you want to put your money there, and when you come back to withdraw it, either from a savings account or from a stock fund or from an insurance policy because you've got a claim, you want the money to be there and you hope it's actually grown. And you also want to be able to hand it over to the next generation. So you want to preserve that capital. But what you also want to do is efficiently allocate that capital to projects. So the people at the top want that money to end up at the bottom of that chain in the real economy doing productive things. And then as they do those productive things, you want that industry to watch over your capital to make sure that the right choices are being made. So here's what I'm going to say is the rub. Here's where the problem comes in. Now, how many people know who Adam Smith is? Okay. So Adam Smith is this sort of famous economist who people always point to as he's the person who sort of figured out why markets work. And Adam Smith, he was a Scottish economist in the 18th century. He sort of used the pin factory as an example. He said, well, first of all, we need, corporations are good and business can be good if people specialize. So I have a pin factory where one person makes the head of the pin, one person sharpens the pin, one person attaches the head to the sharpened, long part, and that's efficient. And I'm going to know how many pins to make as a factory owner because there'll be a demand, and I'll keep making them until it costs me more to make it in the next pin than the next person's going to pay me. And so markets work. He came up with this whole theory, and often people who are champions of capitalism point to Adam Smith. But less well known about Adam Smith is he said that you have to worry about corporations when the owners become separated from the people who are controlling. Because he was right at the beginning of that story of corporations, and he was worried about where the corporations would lead because he was afraid that the managers would take advantage of the owners if they were disconnected. And so he said there's what we now call an agency problem. You've got these stockholders at the top, but then the company's being controlled by managers who aren't the owners. And so the concern was that managers were going to usurp that capital and use it for their own purposes, pay themselves too much, get charter plane. Obviously, they didn't have charter airplanes in the 1700s, but they do now. Things like that you read about the way management might abuse their authority. And so what we came up with, and this didn't happen in like a year or a decade. This is a solution that was developed over, I'd say, the last century. And I call it the shareholder primacy solution. It's a syllogism. So the first premise is that management must act for the benefit of shareholders, right? Because management's at the bottom of the chain and their duty goes upwards. And the second point, this is key, well, shareholders are interested in a financial return. That's why they're putting their money into the system, because they want to preserve their capital and they want to grow their capital. Therefore, the primacy solution syllogism says, the director's duty is to increase the return on stock. That's your job. Anywhere in the chain, if you look up, you're supposed to increase that person's return. So here's the key. What that leads you to conclude is the financial capital, the people putting money down into the system, are indifferent to the strategy of how you maximize that return. They just want a return. That's the theory. So what does this mean? So I've got this triangle here where you're investing capital and you want a return. And I've got these 3 points. And what I want to say is, well, there's 3 different buckets you could put that return in. One is the one you sort of think of. It's green for a reason. It's like when I do something that's actually productive as a company, and then I allow the shareholders to share in that return. So I create a new clean source of energy. I've created value, I've made the economic pie bigger, and my shareholders are going to share in that return. So that's one way you can satisfy your duty up the chain. But here's another way. Economists have picked up this term phishing now from the digital economy, and they talk about when a company figures out or trains its salespeople to use high pressure tactics on consumers. Well, that's going to increase return for the shareholders because the company's going to make more money, but you haven't really created value in the economy. You've just rearranged the decks on the Titanic, if you will. You've taken some money from consumers and put it in the shareholders' pockets, but you haven't really made anything valuable. So that's not so good as creating real value. But the third point, here's the real problem. Another way to make money is actually to create negative value in the world. You can engage in negative sum strategies by, for example, using dirty fuel or using exploitative worker practices and make money. And this is why the capital system that we're involved in today, I call it fundamentally dishonest, because you can look at that company's balance sheet and it shows a positive return because there was a profit earned by the company. But if you looked at everything the company did, you'd have to look at the negative externalities it created. And if you added those all together, the company would have a negative return. So because we focus on capital, because of that syllogism a couple slides earlier, you end up with a fundamentally dishonest system that's not really accounting for the effects that these corporations are having in the world. And I call this the primacy trap. So the negative sum strategy satisfies your up the channel duty to produce value for shareholders. And the problem is that modern investing theory, we call it modern portfolio theory, amplifies this problem, because modern portfolio theory says, well, what investment professionals are supposed to do is maximize return by minimizing risk. And the way you do that is to diversify your investments, and then because that'll lower your risk, but keep your return high. And then to see how you're doing as an investment professional, you compare your returns to the returns of a like basket of securities. And as long as you're meeting or beating the market, then you're considered successful. So managers seek to beat the market. And then here's another point that's really critical. Managers under modern portfolio theory, that's the people who are managing that $350 trillion of capital, treat the performance of the market as an entirety as exogenous, as like not related to what they're doing. They just say, we're in this market, we need to meet it or beat it. But they don't feel that they have any responsibility for how the market performs. But here's the problem. The source of returns for investors is the market. Beta, that's the market return, and alpha, that's the return that is special to a basket of stock or to a stock itself. Most return is just the market. So if you have a defined contribution plan, you're probably in index funds, or if you're not in index funds, you're probably in mutual funds and you're pretty much diversified. Most of the value you're going to have in 20 years, if you leave it there, is from how the market does, not from stocks that your particular manager picks. That's what this is telling you. So let me just give you a little illustration. Here's Ms. Jones. She has her defined contribution plan. She's got insurance. She has a son who's going to in college, and that college has an endowment. Her husband has a defined benefit plan. And you can see that, you know, those plans and insurance policies have their own managers, and they end up investing in all these companies, right? So that's what it looks like. They don't care if one company does better than the other. They need the rising tide to lift all their boats. So that's what the real world looks like. So the lesson I take from this is that modern portfolio theory is wrong. Investor activity, both capital allocation, what companies are invested in, and stewardship, how you vote the shares in those companies, determines market performance. So if companies are, being irresponsible about their carbon budgets, investment managers have the ability to do something about that. They can bring, in the US, in the UK, they can bring resolutions telling the directors to do a better job on carbon performance. And if they were doing that, that might not help any individual company, because the company can't sort of, graze the commons and take advantage of the fact that there's no price on carbon in the jurisdiction they're operating. But even though that company wouldn't get a better return by taking advantage of the market would do better in the long run, because obviously if we keep below 2-degree rise, or 1.5 degree rise, some people would say, we're all going to do better because we will have mitigated the risks of global warming. So that's why investors should actually be focusing on the system. So what investors really need is responsible corporate citizens pursuing sustainable long-term strategies, not trying to graze the commons and find individual advantage. And so don't take my word for it. This is from a report, I think it was issued maybe 2 weeks ago by Aviva Insurance in London. And they say the primary failure of capital markets in relation to sustainable development is one of misallocation of capital. Capital markets do not incorporate companies' full social and environmental costs. This was the fundamental dishonesty I was talking about. Your balance sheet, your profit and loss sheet, doesn't really tell the full story. And so what's this mean? This last sentence, and this is key to all those people we heard from yesterday who are at the early stages of important enterprises. The consequences of this are that unsustainable companies have a lower cost of capital. So when you have your responsible company that takes into account the cost of carbon, that insists that its supply chain is free of exploitation, that insists that its workers get a livable wage, your cost of capital is higher than your competitor who doesn't do that. And that's bad. That's bad for you because it makes it more difficult to scale your business. So this is where top down meets bottom up, and it's important, whatever size your business is, to be concerned about this problem. And this is where we get to the benefit corporation and how it's the way we've solved this issue in the U.S. So the benefit corporation is something that in 35 states in the U.S. and Italy we've used to address this paradigm. It allows you to authentically govern your corporation with sustainability principles. There's three key elements. So first is you expand your purpose, and you say, this company is affirmatively here to do more than deliver a profit. And when I say more, lots of companies do well by doing good and say we have a purpose of treating our workers well, and we have a purpose of, addressing environmental issues, but those aren't primary purposes. Those are ways to get to a profit. With a benefit corporation, the environmental case, the societal case is as strong as the financial return case. They're of equal importance. So you've got this expanded purpose. You've got expanded accountability. Usually in our capital markets, whether it's because of legal system or because of the capital market system, the primary duty of directors is viewed as shareholder return. In a benefit corporation, that's not the case. You also, as a director, have to consider the interests of all your stakeholders, and again, not simply as a subordinate way to get value to your shareholders, but as an end in itself. And finally, you need to be transparent. You have to report to your shareholders, not just on financial issues, but also on sustainability issues. Currently, the law and markets erode sustainability. So as you grow and scale your business and go into capital markets, whether it's venture capital markets, private equity markets, or the public markets, it erodes your purpose. So even if you have a mission, it begins to be eroded. Because one thing, you get into the system where your ultimate goal, however well you try to act, your ultimate goal is the creation of value for shareholders. And whenever there's an exit transaction, this is, you see this in spades. No one ever sells their company to the second highest bidder because the second highest bidder is more responsible. That is how it should work, though. And the benefit corporation allows you to choose that second highest bidder because they're more responsible. And this actually allows business strategies that involve a commitment to stakeholders to not be compromised if you can have a benefit corporation, because in the regular current version, those strategies are compromised because everybody knows the corporation will defect from its other values if it's going to maximize value for shareholders. So the benefit corporation is a tool to address these things. It expands your purpose. It expands what we call the business judgment rule in corporate law, and that's just the idea that directors have lots of discretion, and this expands their discretion so that they can consider stakeholder interests as primary interests. It gives liability, and this is important. This is, in some jurisdictions, this is why you need a statute, because even if you felt comfortable that you had the ability to expand your purpose, you might be concerned in some jurisdictions that if you did so, it would lead, especially in the public markets, to a lot of litigation, because people would try to solve the question of whether you were favoring the environment over workers, over shareholders, over something else. People might be afraid that that would get solved in court, and that makes it very hard to run a business. And so what the benefit corporation statutes do is they protect directors from liability and give them discretion to make these choices. It also gives you flexibility in changing control situations, as I mentioned before. So you don't have to always pick the highest bidder if that's an irresponsible choice from a sustainability perspective. Now you might say, well, that seems naive because these big companies are never going to get there because their shareholders are just going to force them to always be in shareholder value maximization mode. But I think there's hope. First of all, many companies actually thrive by integrating sustainability into their operations. They may be consumer facing, and that may help sell their product. They may see this as a way to mitigate risk. So over the long term, they can create more value. And under conventional corporation governance, that sustainable performance is always contingent on the narrow concepts of fiduciary duty. So people know that there's a risk that you're going to defect. And benefit corporation governance is a way to signal that you are really and truly fully integrating sustainable performance into your purpose. And this full integration permits the creation of durable wealth within a stable system. And so I think of this as sort of a ladder to get from shareholder primacy to creating benefits across the portfolio, because you sort of start by, well, this is enlightened self-interest, and you ultimately get to a place where companies are performing, and most importantly, investors are thinking about creating stable systems. And so you're going to be able to get to a point where a company will say, I will sacrifice, and this is important, I will sacrifice some shareholder value in order to preserve the system, because in the long run, that's going to be better for those people at the top of the investment chain who are invested across the system. So the takeaway here is that benefit corporation status can be used to preserve long-term perspective excuse me, in the public markets. And, you know, in the US, but in other places too, we're seeing this more and more. Shareholders are putting more pressure on the, oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Shareholders are putting more pressure on companies to take actually more short-term shortcuts. And we see this, you know, in sort of a lot of hedge fund activity, where companies that have a sort of reputation for responsibility may be forced to make short-term decisions. We've seen this recently with Etsy, a B Corp, a publicly traded B Corp, that was the subject of some hedge fund activity. Whole Foods, not a B Corp, but very much known as a responsible corporation. And the founder, John Mackey of Whole Foods, also founded the conscious capitalism movement. They were recently the subject of hedge fund activity and ultimately were sold to Amazon. Now, I think John Mackey would say he was very happy with that sale, but he would also say he was very unhappy with the whole process that took him through that. And in fact, last week or 2 weeks ago, at the Be Inspired Festival in Toronto that B Lab held, he spoke. And John Mackey said, and this is a quote, boy, oh boy, do I wish we had been a benefit corporation. So he thought that this really would have helped him, being a benefit corporation, dealing with the short-term pressures of the public markets. And I would also say that now is the time to introduce benefit corporation into the public conversation. Shareholders have, this is a very US-centric slide if you look at the details, but the title itself is true around the globe. Institutions around the globe, institutional shareholders, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurers, have taken the reins and are much more active in governing corporations than they ever have been. They're using that power to diversify boards. State Street, the second largest asset manager in the world, had an initiative to put more women on boards, and they're voting against against boards that don't have sufficient diversity on their boards. They're also increasing shareholder rights. They are very active on pay issues, you know, overpaid CEOs, but less so maybe on environmental and social, although we're seeing a window there. Less so on long-termism issues. But I think the newfound power of the institutional shareholder, combined with some of those issues I've talked about before, is a real opportunity to change the way our capital markets work. So long-term universal investors have more power than they ever have before. Most of their return is based on the return of the market, and their beneficiaries are just plain folks who need a thriving company and a healthy planet more than they need a stock price to take off. So contemporary corporate governance developments represent our best chance to deliver the message that the interests of citizen shareholders who own the market, that's us in this room, is best served by corporations that maximize value across human, natural, and social capital, as well as financial capital. This is the idea that we ought to look honestly at what companies are doing and not just look at their financial return. And benefit corporation governance is the best way to implement this change. So I think these slides, just a couple case studies. So these are a couple venture-backed companies in the US that between DataWorld and AltSchool, the two of them have raised $200 million. Those are benefit corporations, so it's capital providers are willing to invest in benefit corporations. Natura, a Brazilian company you may be familiar with, they just bought the Body Shop. They're not a benefit corporation, but they changed their corporate governance in their charter to basically operate exactly like a benefit corporation. And the other names on this slide are conventional mainstream investors who voted for that change. These are large subsidiaries of large publicly traded companies that have become benefit corporations. So Campbell's Soup has Plum Organics, a baby food maker. Danone Wave, that's Danone's entire North American operations. You know, this is a company that's worth probably over $12 billion based on the amount that Danone paid for White Wave, and then which they incorporated into this sub. And Danone Wave is a benefit corporation. Happy Family is a subsidiary of Procter & Gamble. Lung Biotech is a really interesting biotech company that's developing very interesting technology. They're the largest sub of United Therapeutics, another public company. We just had an IPO this year, the first IPO of a benefit company. Laureate Education raised $490 million. So I think that, you know, the time is now, and honestly, we don't have a lot of time to waste. So I'm going to pause there and
that's
see
great.
if there are questions.
Rick, thank you. Fantastic. Wonderful. Thank you so much. So great. So I'm going to ask, say one thing, and then you and then I open it up. So, and we have Ralph Turm in the room, so I want to also pick your brains. But about 3 or 4 weeks ago, there was a survey done. It looked at about 100 industries and went back and looked at like profits over the last 10 years. And it said if all these industries had actually internalized all this cost, if you had done a full cost accounting, basically the profits would be zero. So this is the dishonest thing that you're saying. And I think it's really very important that you're kind of looking at the whole system and saying, if we actually internalize all these costs, effectively, we would not have made all the profits that we have made. Isn't that true?
Absolutely. And one example I'll just throw out is a World Bank economist did the calculation of the actual cost of a $2 fast food hamburger. And her calculation was the real cost of that hamburger was $200 when you factored in the deforestation, the public health costs, et cetera, of producing that burger.
So this is big stuff, and it's actually at the heart of this whole event here, responsible, economy. So I open up. I want to. Who of you would like a question, just to get a sense of how many questions we're going to have? So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's start with these. So keep it short and ideally concrete. So let's start over here. A microphone, please. Yeah, the gentleman here.
Thanks. Georges Couvard, I'm past chairman of CFOs. I never see, you tell at the beginning that all investors and shareholders are looking to have a return on equity. I am not sure now that the new economy is on this way. You don't tell us the rules of the activity of the green investors or green funds. They are not looking for return on equity. They are looking only to change the company.
Thank you.
What do you think about it?
It's a great question. It's, aren't there investors who are looking for a full social and environmental return? And that's absolutely the case. And I should not have, if I use the word all or every, that was an error. The problem is that it's the bulk of the financial industry still operates that way. So that when you have green investors doing the right thing, that you have other capital rushing in to provide a lower cost of capital to people who aren't doing that, and it creates a very difficult dynamic where both companies and investors who are trying to do the right thing are sort of going against these headwinds.
Okay, thanks. Second, Ralph, you had a question here? Yeah, you go.
It's an observation that leads into a question. I'm 25 years in transparency, sustainability, and so on. And I was, like with the mother milk, I was raised with that one sentence: there is no sustainable business in an unsustainable world. And if you translate that to our economic system, we have to be careful to not sub-optimize as you describe it, a flawed system. So your approach was really to say, we have the B corporations, and now they are bought by some of these major companies. The problem that I have with that is scalability. We have about 7,000 or 8,000 multinationals on active, the ones that you described, like the Danones and so on. We have more than 80,000 multinationals on this planet, which means that more than 90% of those that are on the planet are still visibly inactive. And we don't have much time. So while the B Corporation is serving this bottom-up movement, there also needs to be thinking about a top-down movement around changing our economic system. And the discussion, what I see is that people are shying away from that. Just simply, most sustainability people, don't speak that language. They don't know who to talk to. They don't know how to address it. So they shy away from it and, take pride of their incremental, progresses. The thing is it's not so complex. It's just 4 things that need to happen. The internalization of external effects into cost accounting, a parallel benefit accounting so that we can come to a total contribution of an organization, the serious translation of that into pricing mechanisms so that markets can do what markets do. Markets are agnostic. They just react. And finally, there is taxation. That needs to be aligned with that sort of top-down approach. So I think both need to happen, and I just wonder how you would describe, apart from the chances of the bottom-up movement to succeed to the level of scalability, which I doubt, and the chances of a top-down movement to get us to, finally an economic system that does the right thing automatically.
So yeah, look. I think the four simple things you mentioned are pretty complicated, and I don't think we can afford to not pursue the bottom up, because maybe we'll have enough time, and maybe that's the only way, and we have to keep trying. But I also don't think we can afford to not pursue the top down, and I think in some ways the most we can hope for is a shift in the paradigm, because it was not always the fact that corporations acted like shareholder primacy, was all that mattered. There was a time not so long ago, and I think if you went back 50 or 60 years, when corporations were and multinationals were perfectly comfortable saying that their job was really to provide a good return to shareholders, but also provide, decent work, good products, et cetera. And I know that, in the United States, workers who worked for large companies felt much more secure in their employment 40 or 50 years ago than they do today. So I think there is an opportunity to shift the paradigm and hope to work to some of the details that you're talking about, but just get people to understand the cost of a hamburger, or the cost of doing business. And the last thing I want to say is we also cannot have a sustainable world with unsustainable businesses, and we just have to realize that.
Well, and then I wanted to add, so my role is, and I'm a kind of ambassador for B Corp. I've started B Corps in Europe. Is that this is not the pursuit of a benefit corporation goes in parallel with pursuit of many other things. So we are not saying a benefit corporation is the solution to everything, but it is a very important part of the overall solution. And we need to work on all the things that you also mentioned. Absolutely. Okay, any more questions? There was another hand somewhere. There's a lady there. Try to keep it a little concrete if you can. You go.
How do you see the valuation of the B Corp values in Asia, specifically in China, where a good flow of the investment money is coming from?
I think I'm going to defer to Marcello on that.
What I can say is that there are about 40 B Corps in Asia. We've started Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, and a couple of, more, 3 or 4 in Japan. You say China specifically? So China, so one of the challenges is that we had to do everything in Chinese, and it's actually a massive work. So we are now working with the Chinese Foundation to help fund that work of translating all the assessment and the whole kind of, all the know-how behind the B Corp impact assessment in Chinese. So we are making steps, and the idea is by 2019, 2020 to really try to develop the B Corps in China. Well, how do they consider it? So, speaking about the philosophy, so the philosophy, let's say there are 2 things that are obviously connected, but philosophy is not the legislation. So what Rick is talking about, the legislation. The philosophy is that quite often the Chinese business leaders would say, well, this was the way of harmony, the Confucian way of doing business, at least in theory, is what we also practice in China. It was also very similar to the benefit corporation. In practice, of course, it's not exactly like that, because we know China, and of course, not only China, many other countries are abusing the system or have created a dishonest system, like Rick was saying. So this is the challenge we face, that the theory is different from the practice. But, we are working on that, and of course, we want this to become a global movement, and now, China, of course, is a very big country, so we have to do this pretty well and properly. Thank you. Any more here?
Thanks very much for the very interesting presentation. So I'm representing the International Trade Union Confederation, so we're a global body representing organized labor in 160 countries, including the US. So naturally, we're very interested in questions around working conditions, wages, respect for workers' rights in a responsible organization. So I would like to know more concretely from you what kinds of criteria are really being integrated into this sustainability of operations. What kind of criteria is being factored into your impact assessments? Particularly as concerns to decent working conditions, respect for workers' rights, collective bargaining, etc.
Very good question. Great.
So for speaking to sort of the B-Lab impact assessment itself, it's like a very detailed and sort of, I don't think we can go into it now, but it would be worth a good session. But there is definitely an entire section on workers' rights, and the way the assessment works is, you talk about how large your company is, what geography you're in, what business you're in, and a couple other things. And based on that, you get an assortment of questions and weighting. And so if you're in an industry where workers' rights are important and where there are workforce issues, your question's likely to be more heavily weighted. I think something, just to be honest, that we're on version 5, and we go through a 2-year cycle, although we've expanded to 3 years, so we're already working on version 6. I think something that we're trying to focus on in the next version is contract workers, because we pick up employees, but we don't do as good a job, perhaps, picking up the conditions of contract workers in our supply chain. So that's something that we're working on. One thing I would say to you and trade union organization is, one thing we try to say to people to sort of think about what I was talking about is, all unions control huge amounts of pension funds, and they should be voting their shares in those pension funds and investing the shares in those pension funds with the same principles. So it's important, for a pension fund not to vote to get an extra nickel in a takeover if that's going to affect workers' rights. So all the parts of the organization need to be in full communication. I'm happy to have a discussion with you about that at some point.
Yeah, no, I wanted to actually, if I may ask you, because this is actually potentially a very interesting area also for B-Lab to work more with union organizations. Mm-hmm. So how do you see that? Is it something we could do together? I mean, more than we are doing already?
So we've been involved in actually certification processes for responsible businesses. We're a liaison organization for the ISO. We also work with the Ethical Trading Initiative. And we think it's really important, in fact, that workers' representative organizations are involved in the process around defining criteria for a sustainable organization on working conditions, et cetera. So I'm happy to exchange and share contacts with you if you think this would be interesting and useful for you.
Great. We'll do that. Thank you very much. Thank you. Great. Okay, next. Nathan Gilbert, BLAB Europe.
So thanks, Marcello, and thank you, Rick. As Marcello said, I'm with BLAB Europe, so I'm quite intimate with this topic, and also happy to talk to you about what are the metrics that we look at within the impact assessment. But to piggyback on what you just asked, back to Rick, I mean, the impact assessment that we use to certify companies have a lot of different criteria that we look at, and it's the aggregated points that you accumulate from going through this, positive-facing impact assessment that allows you to become a certified B Corp. But what you're talking about with the corporate governance element of this doesn't necessarily require you to meet minimum standards on that assessment. You have to be transparent about how you're performing against a bunch of different indicators, looking comprehensively about your performance of a company overall, but there is no minimum bar. And I'm just curious to get your perspective on where you see that going, because really it's, we can get the paradigm shift, we can get the companies to measure their performance, but, where do we see the need to push companies to actually meet minimum bars of performance, because you could be a benefit corporation and perhaps have a low bar in terms of what you're trying to achieve in terms of positive impact on society and the environment. And I'm curious about where you see those forces pushing and how can we do more?
Right. So it's important to emphasize the difference between a benefit corporation, which is just a legal form which gives the directors obligations to consider all stakeholders, and a B corporation, which is something that our organization has certified is actually having positive impact on the world. And the way I think the way I explain, people often say, well, benefit corporation might be a bad idea because you'll say you're a benefit corporation and that you're good for all stakeholders, but maybe you'll just be practicing plain old shareholder primacy. You'll just kind of use it as a disguise to pretend that it's a greenwashing problem. And the analogy I make is, well, it's just like a standard corporation that has shareholder primacy embedded. There's nothing within the corporate law that certifies that you're actually making a profit for your shareholders. And in fact, some, for-profit conventional shareholder primacy companies go bankrupt. They do a terrible job. And it's the same thing with a benefit corporation. There's no assurance that you're going to be doing a good job, providing value for all stakeholders and being sustainable just because you're a benefit corporation. It's all about enabling. This is all about saying, let's get rid of this part of our capital system, the shareholder primacy. Let's get rid of that, because that's a barrier to creating a better, more sustainable world. And then we need to do lots of other work in terms of standards, in terms of tax schemes, you name it. But this is just like part of the puzzle.
Okay, so I wanted to just, and Ralph, I'll come to you, but I wanted to say, here we are in Lille. So what about some French opinions here? Or does anyone have anything to say about how could this develop further in France? Is there a conversation going on in France about new legal forms, etc.? Does anyone want to say something here?
Good morning. Here there's a lot of talking about integrated CSR reporting. And I was wondering what the relation would be between the two, because that could be a top-down approach.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked that, and I should have sort of talked a little bit about that in my slides. So integrated CSR, and sometimes an integrated reporting movement, the idea, this is a way of addressing the dishonesty, right? To say, well, when you report, we don't want you to just have like a separate glossy CSR report. We want you to integrate that with your financial reporting. So when you report on what your financial bottom line is, we also want you to report on what your human rights bottom line is, what your livable, wage bottom line is. So integrate all those things together. One way I like to think about benefit corporations is integrated governance. So just like an integrated CSR report would have all these bottom lines, you ought to have all these bottom lines in the boardroom. When you're when the board is deciding where to locate a factory, what sort of technology to use, making a decision about, redundancies. They should be thinking about the human capital bottom line, the social capital bottom line, the environmental bottom line, as well as the financial bottom line. So I think the two things really go hand in hand.
Okay, great. So I think there are some, hand here, there are some students and professors here. If anyone wants to ask anything, if you, professors, students, please, don't be shy. But in the meantime, here, there's someone else here.
Thank you. I'd be curious to know your views on where we stand and what are the perspectives of this, I don't know how to call it, this comprehensive way to report or to account for the externalities. So how far are we to change the framework that is currently being used to report for financial statements in the companies?
So there's, probably some people in this room could answer that question a lot better in terms of the EU directive, which I think maybe has been delayed a little bit, but there's certainly a directive here in the EU to have reporting for public companies and other large private companies. The US, there's been some discussion at the SEC, but I think the challenge is the methodology. These aren't easy questions. I mean, one problem is it's relatively easy to report on financial bottom line. I mean, it's dollars and cents. It's harder to report on environmental bottom line because people don't even agree. Like, what's the goal? Is it 1.5 degrees? Is it 2 degrees? Is it too late? And should we just be worrying about adaptability? And is it too late to mitigate? People have different answers to these questions. And like, in a way, my part's the easy part. Like, hey, let's all focus on the bottom line. That's obvious. What's hard is to actually calculate that bottom line. But the fact that it's hard doesn't mean we shouldn't be trying because, again, I don't know what the choice is if we want to have, a world for our grandchildren.
Yeah, and I also want to say this is one of the things that I took away from yesterday is that, in fact, if you really focus on impact, that could be a source of your profit. So we're not saying that there's a penalty for actually going the impact way. We are saying actually that could be actually the route to your profitability in the future. So that's also something that needs to be positioned properly. I mean, not positioned. We have to, perhaps we as part of this movement need to be better at communicating those facts, reality. Okay, Ralph, please, I think short because we...
I'll always aim short. I never succeed. But just also as a response to the last question, also with the European directive in mind, all the reporting regimes, most of them that we have, are still ingrained in the do no harm sphere. Do less bad. Yep. And that's what companies do. And then we have ratings and rankings who say who's best in class of those that say that they became less bad in what they do. That's the status. There's a whole movement called Reporting 3.0, which I am the managing director of, around 6,000 people worldwide who rethink reporting, and I'll have a session tomorrow on that. So please come if you want to hear more about that. That is really to move us from do no harm to do good. And there's a whole strategy continuum where sustainability is just in the middle because there's also regeneration, there is thriving. And the question is, how do we get to a reporting system that includes, a right focus on purpose, a right focus on success measurement in the future, total contribution I mentioned, and to solve that scalability problem. But what you were saying indicates to me something that we also advocate for in Reporting 3.0, and that is to shift from shareholders and stakeholders to rights holders. Because sustainability has to be proven in the light of thresholds and allocations. What is an organization able to actually take from nature in a fair share? And that normally doesn't happen, the discussion, because the stakeholders are not rightly informed. We don't have the same eye-level discussion. So every stakeholder as a rights holder has a right to know. And I think with the whole data explosion that we have, we just need to supply stakeholders with the right sort of data and level of data. So just as a comment on shifting expectations and as you mentioned, mindsets.
Well, great, thank you. Do you want to make any comment? And I'm going to, because time is up, so I'm going to, well, first of all say, do you want to comment on that? Do you have any response? Because I think that So what I want to say is that, for example, when I read, like I said, I mentioned 3 or 4, maybe 2 months ago, this report looking at 20 years, 100 industries, that basically if you internalize all the cost, you have 0 profit. That was quite new to me. So I think we're all learning and getting new data about the reality of what you say, this dishonest system. So we have to keep pushing in that direction, get more and more data out.
Yeah, no,
So
my only comment is I'm glad to hear that project, and I want to learn more about it.
So I'm going to close by saying this is a book that Rick has written. This is hot off the press, Benefit Corporation Law and Governance, Pursuing Profit with Purpose. So Rick is here. You can talk to him. He may have a copy or he may sell you a copy. So thank all of you for being here, for joining the session. And Rick, thank you so much for giving the session. Okay.
And it's available on Amazon Europe.